Thanks for joining us Behind the Frontline, a podcast providing timeless solutions to everyday workforce and workplace challenges. Frontline Training Solutions is an express employment professionals company, strategically placed between the workplace and the workforce with professionals standing by, ready to combat your unique challenges. Learn more about what we do at frontlineon.com. Well, hello again, and welcome to another episode of Behind the Frontline, where we tackle workplace solutions and the challenges that are keeping you up at night. And today we're talking about communication pitfalls and how they can affect communication in the workplace. And I'm sitting in the studio with Ryan Williams and Lorraine Medici, two of our all-star staff members here at Frontline. Ryan and Lorraine, why don't you introduce yourselves a little bit?
Okay, sure. My name's Lorraine Medici. I'm the Director of Training and Development, and glad to be here with you guys this morning.
Yeah, I'm Ryan Williams. I'm a Leadership and Team Development Manager here at Frontline.
Yeah.
All right, yeah, so we had a webinar recently. We had 1,000 registrants from all over the world. In fact, I want to read some of those countries that attended. Not only do we have all 50 states present, but we also had Belgium, Brazil, Canada, Colombia, France, Germany, Hong Kong, Italy, Japan, Sweden, United Kingdom, United States. Cool. I mean, isn't that incredible?
Yeah. Well, I think it just proves it's an international topic. It's
absolutely
great. Yeah. It doesn't matter where you are, who you are. It's part of the human experience.
Yeah. Do you guys want to talk about a little bit on the webinar and what we covered and just kind of 30,000 foot view?
Yeah, big picture view. Excuse me. So big picture view is we all experience communication pitfalls. And the definition we gave around pitfalls are things that are there that we don't see, right, that are kind of under the surface or happening, which is why they're pitfalls, is we often will trip and fall or into these things that cause miscommunication.
Yeah, and I think the goal of our webinar was to highlight 10. And they were anywhere from making assumptions and interpretations to matching your communication style to the communication style of somebody else, or at least flexing with it. And Ryan went into talking about DESK, which is a phenomenal tool. Also matching my communication style to the development level of where somebody is. Do I need to be more of a teacher, or do I need to be more of a coach with this person? Or do I need to just be kind of hands off and be there as a resource, kind of give them that autonomy? Right.
Yeah, we talked about a level of directness. A lot of times what we talked about traditionally what has been trained around how to give feedback, and talked about feedback as being a foundational skill or tool around communication. Because, there's the quote is the greatest...
the single greatest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
We use that quote a lot. Yeah.
It's in our training room, and I remember when we had that room put together, I said, I want it there so my eyes can see it all the time.
And who was that by?
George Bernard Shaw.
And why don't you, we do use it a lot, and you mentioned it. Why don't you talk a little bit about why that quote is so impactful to what we do?
Well, I think it helps, in Ryan's Leadership Foundations class, or if you're going through purpose-driven leadership training, or any of it doesn't matter what training you're going through. It goes back to what Ryan said about the pitfalls. It's the assumption that, wait a minute, we had this conversation. And a lot of times why I think it is so impactful for me, Nic, is that I caught myself years and years ago with Janice when I was having a meeting with her, and her communication style as a driver and an influencer is very big picture, very fast. And she was throwing out a lot of names, and I probably was somewhat distracted in my listening. And I remember walking out and literally stopping outside of her office going, did she want me to talk to Tom, or was that John? And I remember right there is already creating an illusion of doubt. And I remember, then you replay it in your head. And I remember going, I'm pretty sure it was John. Yeah. Okay, so we take off. 2 weeks later, come back. She goes, how did that conversation go with Tom? And I went, it didn't, but good one with John, So, and I didn't follow through correctly. So I had doubt. And instead of just turning around and going, gee, I just want to make sure I'm aligned with you, I went ahead. And so there was that illusion. So from that point on, I made kind of a rule to myself: if I have doubt, I don't get to leave the conversation. I gotta come back. And Ryan and I are gonna kind of role play later.
Yeah. Well, it's the funny thing is at least you realize it. I think I've had so many times in communication where I used to run events and had a team that would set up event things, and multiple occasions I didn't learn the first time around. It took me a couple times where it's like, all right, you guys got it, after some somewhat elaborate setup, instructions and expectations, and they're confident, right? And they go, yep, we got it. They'd only done something like this maybe once or twice. They didn't really have it. And I walked away, then I came back and nothing was the way it was supposed to be. And how many times has that happened to probably all of us? And so there was this illusion in my mind that communication had taken place. And a lot of times when we were working, I had a relatively new team. And when we're working with people that we don't really know what the cues are, we don't really know if they got it, a lot of times they'll say, I got it, for lots of different reasons. Maybe they think they do. Maybe they don't want to look stupid. Maybe, you thought you were clearer than you were. And a lot of times, when we talk about leadership development and communication, the biggest aha that people take away from one of our sessions is just because somebody says, got it, doesn't necessarily mean they do. So I think, I love the way you say this, Lorraine, is what's the evidence that they got it, right? That's that closing that gap. We talk about feedback. Feedback isn't just got it. It's what's the evidence that they actually did understand. They should be able to repeat back what they understood around the situation.
Yeah, that's a good tool. It's a silly, cute example, but I do the same with my kids. Where I ask them to think about something or do something, and after a couple years of doing that and realizing they're not getting this, I started asking them to the same, say it back to me. And it was cute. Some of the things they said back to me was completely off from the original question, but eventually they got it. And what other communication pitfalls are, let's just say, I don't want to say the top 5, but what are some very common communication pitfalls that you see in the workplace that our participants could probably relate to?
Well, I'm just thinking about, we did this webinar on Thursday, right? Yeah. And Friday, I had some training, and it was interesting because that was on my mind as our webinar. I think one of the pitfalls is bringing your triggered reactions to the conversation. And I'm talking to myself when I say that, right? I have to, I watched a couple people in this training were very triggered about what we were talking about, and their communication was shut down or be very in your face about it, very negative, which you talked about, or talked about only being negative.
And when you say trigger, I mean that emotionally hijacked state, right? Is I love the way that our coworker Dana talks about this, right? Is they're just full, they're to the brim
of emotions,
of emotion, of that sense of, and when we talk about our frontal cortex is essentially it's not functioning,
right?
And so that affects communication completely.
But so watching, body language like this, eyes down. Right. Basically,
arms crossed.
And I don't typically have a problem with people having their arms crossed because I think you got to have the whole package here. But it was absolutely, they were not interested in talking to me and the other person. And arms crossed, eyes down, or giving me one of these real quick. And that definitely, as an eye in the disc, that's going to trigger me. And I have to really, really this is not about me. This is just about this person, wherever they're at. Maybe there's stuff going on. Who knows? Because if I'm going to come into this conversation triggered, it's going to change the way we communicate.
Yeah. So what would you say in that situation for anyone listening? They're in a workplace meeting and there's someone sitting across from them and they are just completely non-verbally shut down. They could be dealing with anything going on in their life. What would be a good tool to use or something to remember for the person who is initiating that conversation to...
Well, and I want to hear what you have to say, Ryan. I want to say that I've been in that place where I feel like I'm shut down, where I'm like, okay, I'm triggered. And so instead of kind of being a mess, I'll kind of pull back. I think what would help me, quite honestly, if somebody said, Lorraine, you look like you're a little perplexed by that. Tell me what's going on. Giving me the space to be able to say something, providing that psychological safety, which we talked about on Thursday, for me is helpful. Now, that may not be helpful for somebody else to be put on the spot. I have no problem being put on the spot like that to be able to, because I'm going to want to be able to talk my way out. Ryan, what do you think about the person who's not as eager to want to say that? What do you think might be a good thought on that?
Well, I'm right with you. I think in group settings, that could put somebody like it might not help them so it might be a good opportunity to follow up afterwards.
Yeah.
But I do think that's a next level communication skill, is we very quickly want to interpret body language and decide. I think what I heard you saying there is, well, because they're exhibiting this, it must mean that.
Yeah.
And so that's an assumption, right? So what you want to do is you want to challenge that assumption and you want to go and say, hey, I've noticed what I call it active listening body language. So in the same way, I want to active listen. If you're familiar with that tool, it's that feedback skill of saying, hey, this is what I heard you say. Let me summarize it back to you and tell me if I'm on the same page. Well, next level would be, hey, this is the body language I'm seeing, and this is how I'm interpreting it. And then you give them an opportunity to agree, disagree, clarify understanding. So I'm right with you. I think the only difference I would make, depending on, this is where situational awareness becomes really helpful in knowing the person and knowing their style, knowing all those things, knowing how to get the best out of them, right? So it might be following up with them afterwards going, hey, I noticed you seemed a little, shut down during that meeting.
Yeah.
Talk to me. I think some of us are very observant. I think Lorraine, even this morning, I was like just doing my thing and she's observing my body language. I'm like, I'm good. I don't know exactly what you're seeing, but you asked me. Whereas for me, I'm not as quick to call out somebody's body language or things like that because talk about the disc. I'm a D. This is where this stuff becomes really helpful.
I just want to jump on something that Ryan said. So for the people who are listening, when Ryan was just explaining about going to the person afterwards who would not be comfortable in verbalizing how they're feeling in a meeting, but going, hey, here's the body language that I'm observing. I just want to kind of see what you're really doing is kind of exhibiting that level of curiosity in a way that's not judgmental. Like you weren't saying it like, what was that?
Yeah.
You were just more, hey, this is what I'm seeing. I'm just curious. And we talked about curiosity on Thursday. And curiosity is just one of the best tools that you can use in communication.
Yeah, that's actually, we have a word in local, like in our internal culture, we all choose a word that we focus on at the beginning of each year. And that word is going to help define the way we think and the way we act and the way we operate. And my word for the year is curiosity.
Oh, you picked that one.
I
Okay.
picked that one out. Yeah. Because it is important.
Yeah, it really is. I'm so glad. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think to improve communication is we always talk about identifying behaviors or the actual specific actions. That's why I actually paused and I said, you seemed shut down. Now, that was the best word I could come up with. What I didn't want to say, I was trying to stay away from disengaged. Because now I know this might sound super nuanced to y'all, but to say disengage is like I'm judging and I'm making an assumption about why they seemed disconnected or all those different words I could use. And why I chose that one, maybe disconnected would be a better one. what will help communication is if we're really thinking about the words we're using. Lorraine, you always say words mean things. It's going to help communication if we can be very specific about what we mean when we're saying that. Because if I would have used judgment language of like, it just seemed like you didn't care this morning. It's like, okay, that's going to set them on edge. Talk about, it's like, what do you mean I didn't care? I care, And so we talk about when giving feedback or having conversations, you want to you identify the behavior or the specific actions and stay away from judgment language is the words that we say, because judgment language actually isn't helpful. It's actually letting those assumptions and that internal narrative about what they feel and think about things, which we may be way off.
Absolutely.
On what's actually happening. So that's why I paused there, but it's trying to be really intentional about that.
So I'm going to be devil's advocate.
I was about to be as well.
Oh, were you?
Yeah.
Okay, let's see if we're the same thing. The devil's advocate piece in this might be, well, what am I going to have to sit here and soft pedal or, walk on landmines to make sure that, okay. And
it's a lot of energy.
Yeah. And I would absolutely say no to that. I think what you need to do is have a greater self-awareness and social awareness to know, I know my teammate Ryan. Okay, Ryan is so patient with me. And on Friday, I'm going to bring this example up. We were having a meeting and I could tell he was like, he ran out of patience because he was talking and he dropped his pen and kind of went, rolled his eyes. Okay, I know enough about him to know, okay, I've pushed him. And I wanted to make sure that I went and apologized for that. But I think what you need to do is recognize that, you're not going to be able to be in tune to every sensitivity, but there are things that we can be aware of. And I think, is there a difference between saying you look disengaged versus, here's what you look like. I just noticed it felt like you were shutting down. You kind of had your arms crossed. You kind of looked down. So I'm describing the behaviors of what I saw. Hey, Ryan, I could be completely wrong here, but I care enough to just know it is something up.
Yeah.
My wasn't going to have the same devil's advocacy.
Okay.
Mine was more from the other perspective of the person who's exhibiting the nonverbal reaction. So something that I'd say my biggest communication barrier that I've dealt with, my entire life is the way that I respond nonverbally. And I'd say that you guys know me pretty well. Lorraine, you might know me better than most people in this world when it comes to how I respond nonverbally. It's funny because Lorraine knows when I'm upset just by sitting in a meeting. She knows when something has triggered me, and the same for her. I know when she is upset. But there's been times in my life where I'm sitting there and I'm listening, and I'm just listening so intensely that they'll stop and say, "What are you upset about?" I'm like, "I'm not upset right now. I'm just really listening." A good example is when I was in the Navy and my chief asked me to get up and do something, and I was like, "Yeah." And I got up and I kind of walked towards them, and then she turned around and said, "Why are you so upset all the time whenever I ask you to do something?" And I was like, "I'm not. Very happy to do whatever you want me to do." And it wasn't me saving face. It was an honest reaction. And so what I started doing in the last year or two is I've started practicing listening in front of a mirror and what that would look like, because I realized I'm now receiving this feedback so much that my nonverbal communication is telling people that I'm upset, that I don't care. But the truth is I do care. I'm not upset. I'm just listening really intensely. And so I started practicing in front of a mirror, practicing what do my eyebrows look like? What does my smile look like? What do my, I don't know if you've noticed a difference in the last couple of years, but really working hard at it.
Good for you.
Yeah. What would you guys say are some other communication pitfalls that, might get us in trouble at work?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a good example of reading too much into stuff like that. It's, again, we want clarity. I think just this morning I had no bad feelings. I was totally fine. And there's two people I actually stopped and said, "Is everything okay?" I was like, "I don't know what you guys are talking about," you know? And so that sometimes, I mean, that can get exhausting if that's like
Sure.
every 20 minutes somebody's. So I think
you
what
okay? Are you
ownership do I,
okay?
yeah, are you okay? Are you okay? Are you
Yeah, that's triggering in itself. Yeah, no, fine. Leave me alone.
Yeah. And I think that comes from getting to know each other. I think what I say, I said, I don't know, I don't remember who said this, but all communication is personal. And that really triggers something to me. Is like the more we get to know each other, the more we start to understand the different ways that we communicate, and when we're pushing each other's buttons, and then trust at the foundation of we talk about a psychological sense of safety. Well, that requires me to believe that whatever you're saying or doing is in my best interest, and that changes wholeheartedly
Sure.
communication. I think too often that's not the case in communication. We tend to move towards defense and believe that the thing that person is communicating to me is in their best interest and not in mine.
What do you mean by that? Can you expound a little bit?
So I think I say this in almost every podcast, but it inevitably comes up. This thing called fundamental attribution error, right? I prescribe.
Yeah, explain that.
Yeah, fundamental attribution error. That idea of I prescribe some action or something to some character flaw in the other person, meaning they said that or they did that because they're upset with me, they're an angry person, they're this, that, or the other thing. And again, back to that interpreting things, but it's often I'll believe the other person is a flawed example. I think my favorite example is the one that Lencioni gives when he talks about this. If you're not familiar with Patrick Lencioni, he wrote 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, and he really simplified it for me. He said, when somebody cuts you off in traffic,
It's the worst.
What do you think? What do you say?
Yeah.
And I ask this question all the time, and people are like, "Well, I can't say it here," and then but then, typically we'll say something like they're a terrible driver, they're a jerk, they're an idiot. People, every city I've lived in, everybody here is a terrible driver. They say about Grand Rapids, they say about, shout out to my Hong Kong friends, they said it about, people are just bad drivers, every city I've lived in. And so it's like, are there good drivers anywhere? Apparently not. But when I cut somebody off,
You have a reason.
yeah. Oh, I didn't mean to, or I'm in a hurry, or oops, didn't see you there. It's not because I'm a terrible driver. And I think that happens in communication is, again, that interpretation around behavior, whether it's facial expressions, tone, whatever it is. Talk about jumping to conclusions. I think, if you didn't watch the webinar, but go watch Tom and Natalie, and I imagine a lot of people think, well, she's a terrible boss. I'm willing to bet that most people thought, well, she's just not being considerate, right? All these different thoughts that we had around Natalie's communication to Tom. And it's because we like to attribute things not to like poor skills but bad intent, bad intent.
And I think too, what we have to keep in mind of is we are never going to get this communication thing. I'm going to really say this completely, nail it. And I think we have to come to terms that the best that we can do is accept that some days, especially if you're working on communication, my communication was really good. And sometimes I didn't do a good job. And I think that's a lot that has to do with the whole idea we were talking about, the amount of information and data that the brain collects. Yeah. Not only that is we all have different experiences in our life that produces a lens of life that says that face looks like that to me. And I'm not even conscious that I'm thinking that. It's just this, minuscule amount of time that goes, oh, this little bit of data says that. And I've done this many times. I've done this with Ryan, that we'll be sitting in a meeting. I'll lean over and I'll go, does Nic look like he's upset? And Ryan inevitably will go, I don't see that. right?
Almost every time.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm for some reason I'm picking up that. Well, a lot has to do with that our brain is trying to understand, and how do I navigate with you, and how do I navigate with you? And quite honestly, we're a lot of times not going to get it right. That's why being curious, like I could afterwards say, Nic, you seem like you're a little out of sorts. I could be misreading you, but I just wanted to check in on you because I care about you. And you're like, not at all. I was listening to.
Yeah, normally you'll just text me, right?
Yeah. What up, bud?
What's up? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is a good segue into just the transactional model of communication. And obviously, if you're a communication nerd like we are, I went to school for it, and stuff thrills me. But I've always learned that you're never not communicating, and that really plays to your nonverbal, just the way you respond and act. But the transactional model of communication is the communication loop. And you guys talked about that in the webinars. I was hoping that we can kind of dive into that a little bit and how to close the loop with appropriate feedback. But some of the things that we've already talked about in terms of the lens or the frame of reference. And then I specifically want to talk a little bit about noise and how that affects our communication and how we respond to communication, how we give appropriate feedback. So just maybe you can talk a little bit about the loop and some of the elements of that and how we can.
What do you think about maybe doing that role play at this point? Or do you want to talk a little bit more about the loop first?
Well, let's talk about the loop, because I think it'll be helpful for people to picture what's happening there. Yeah, I guess we can talk about it. And I mean, Nic, I think you probably know this even on a deeper level, but the idea is when I communicate, and we're never not communicating. When I communicate, I'm inevitably encoding my message. When I say encoding, it means I'm speaking it from my experience, my perspective, my lens,
frame of reference.
My frame of reference. You talk about
I think it's called field of experience. I'll throw a chart on the screens as we're talking about it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Let me give you an example of this. With my team, we did a team building day, and this just popped into my head, but we were playing paintball as like a fun team building thing. Not everybody loved it, but I loved it. But we were playing, and I was like pinned down, and there are other people with me in this like castle, and they go, "They're coming from over there." And I went, "Where is over there?" They go, "Over there." I have no idea what they're talking about, because inevitably, I talk about miscommunication. Inevitably, I do not know what their frame of reference is. I don't know where they're looking. They're up somewhere, up in the castle somewhere, and they just are frustrated that I'm not understanding. I'm frustrated with them because I'm feeling, you can, if you've ever played, you can feel like the splatters of stuff coming at you, and it hurts, so you don't want to get hit. So it's a high stress situation. So inevitably, we're both I'm encoding the message, and they're encoding their message, and we have to decode, or we're going to inevitably decode the message through our frame of reference, through our field of experience, through our assumptions, because if we talked about in the webinar, our brains are assumption-making machines. They have to be, or else we couldn't function our day-to-day. So that's what's happening in that transaction of communication. And we have to throw that back and forth, so to speak, that message back and forth to eventually land on a clear understanding.
Right. Yeah. So the person formatting the message is the encoder, and then they send the message over a channel, which in our situation right now, we're just talking. So this is our channel, but that could also be
face-to-face.
Face-to-face. It could be via email. It could be via television or a text message. Yeah. I mean, how many times have we miscommunicated in a text message? But then that message goes through the channel to the sender, who is then decoding that message and then providing it back to the sender through feedback. So ideally, yeah. And that feedback could be semantic, it could be nonverbal, it could be anything. But what I want to kind of dive into a little bit is about the aspect of noise. And there's 4 different types of noise, and that's psychological, physiological, semantic, and
psychological.
Did I say psychological?
Physical.
There it is. Physical, psychological, physiological, and semantic. And look those up if you're curious to know more about those. But that could be anything, from a jackhammer outside the window, or my stomach is rumbling because I forgot breakfast this morning, or the fact that maybe I had a fight with my wife last night and I'm still thinking about that.
Sure.
Or maybe you're dealing with something that's going on in your life and you're dealing with something that's going on in your life and you're not interpreting the message clearly right now. Or maybe it's that goes back to what we talked about with nonverbal, where I'm arms are crossed and you're confused on why I am nonverbally not expressing that I am excited to be a part of this conversation. So what are some tools, or maybe not tools, but what are some ways that a leader can acknowledge that noise and not let it affect them? Or I don't know. What do you guys think about this?
Well, I think you did a really good job this morning before we started our podcast.
Let's call me out.
Yeah, they're going to call you out. You were vulnerable enough and self-aware enough to go, hey, I'm tired, but I'm here. I'm here. So it was one or two sentences, but it made me right away. Number one, respect that you were just transparent enough to go, here's where I'm at. And it made me want to give you more grace and understanding. You're doing a great job, by the way, in this podcast. But
Thank you.
yeah, but for you, that's kind of a physical piece maybe that was going on for you right now. So I personally think it part of my communication is being able to go, and I know that these guys have heard this because I've been rumbling with this respiratory. It's like, I'm just not working on all cylinders
So
right
transparency.
now. Yeah.
And just what's going on personally, just being open and having that trust even with your coworkers to be able to talk about that openly.
Yeah, I think, and I said this in the webinar, communication is a two-way street. And if I think as you mentioned leadership, if I believe that good communication is the monologue, like we talked about earlier, then I've missed it. I've missed it. I'm actually a good speaker. And I use that word because that means I'm really, I think a lot of times when people say, oh, I'm a good communicator, they're really focused on their ability to speak.
Get their
more
message out,
to type a really nice email. That means it doesn't necessarily mean you're a good communicator. Your ability to communicate is really based upon your ability to understand noise, to break through the noise and make sure that you're closing that gap or that loop of communication. I think that's where you talk about, bring it back to the pitfall. That is the pitfall. And we talk about the pitfall in communication is the belief that as a leader, my job is just to make a really compelling one-way message. You don't know if you're a good communicator until you've confirmed it with the people that you're working with, that you lead, that you communicate with.
And something else I want to challenge too is the aspect of noise. Is that you kind of mentioned this earlier in the podcast. You cannot eliminate noise for people. You cannot do it. The only thing you can try to do is to communicate through it or above it. But noise is inevitable, and especially since 2020, when every workplace team went on Zoom and started talking through big meeting groups in Zoom digitally. Now, when you're in a conference room and you're talking to 8 different people, you're able to at least control some of that noise. There's still aspects of physiological and psychological and semantic that you cannot always control, but you were able to control it to an extent. But when we went to Zoom and now you've got 10 different screens and they're all dealing with, cats on the floor and babies crying in the background and
emails coming in.
It's nearly impossible to control that noise. So I actually came up with my own acronym and filter that I could start, helping to not communicate, like eliminate noise, but almost rise above it. I call it cricket. I know you guys have heard it before. If you know me personally, you probably heard me talk about this before. But it's just kind of a tool, just a frame or a lens to look through in terms of not eliminating noise, but kind of being the loudest cricket in the field and just trying to rise above that noise. And it's just all about being clear, being relatable, being intentional with your communication, consistency, and this also applies to branding. I've talked a lot about this in terms of employer branding. Consistency, kinetic, is your communication scalable with your team? Is it flexible with your company? And that's more for branding. Is it engaging enough to hold their attention? Is it truthful or transparent? Whatever that means for you. And that's really just all about clarity. It's about being relatable. It's about being intentional, about being consistent, and so on.
Something we haven't talked about, but I do see as a big gap a lot of times for anybody that's a new manager, which is who I'm talking to a lot, is the consistency factor that you brought up. Thank you for sharing that, because I think you brought up something really critical, is not relying on haphazard, let me catch you in the hall type of communication. We talk about different leadership competencies, or just different effectiveness measures of, do I know if I'm going to be effective? And one of them is systematic communication. And that's where that consistency, that systematic, I think too often what I see with leaders is we don't realize how much communication it requires to turn a ship. I was talking about the analogy of the dinghy versus the ship. When you are an individual contributor, or even just you and one or two other people, it's very easy to be maneuverable. If we want to turn left, it takes me to turn to the other person and say, hey, we're turning left. Okay, everybody's good. But if now you're driving a ship, if you got 5, 6, 7, 20 people, 30 people, you're driving a ship.
Navy ships.
Yeah.
There's cities on the water,
Yeah. And which there's a organization, shout out to my ship crew workers out there if you ever listen to this podcast. But if you're going to turn left, how much communication does that, when you start to think about, I'm a ship now, I'm at the helm of a ship. If I take a hard left, I always ask, what happens if I didn't communicate effectively? Talk about change management, all these different things. But I think there's that's a huge pitfall. Talking about pitfalls we didn't talk about, the amount of systematic communication requires now that you're a supervisor, now that you're a leader, how systematic, consistent, and clear you need to be before you make that left.
I think that's a good metaphor to keep in mind. If you've got 20 people, you're not in a dinghy, right? Yep. You're in the ship.
And talk about that noise, all that noise that's happening, and how many times you have to communicate something before it clicks. How many times do we leave Zoom meetings, or we leave these different things and we went, what exactly did we decide there?
Yeah. Well, it goes back to cricket on your being intentional is part of that systematic communication.
And that is a big gap that I think that's definitely missed a lot as a skill, as something to develop, especially if I'm a leader. Anybody who's been leading an organization, hopefully this has clicked for you. But this is something I think is probably one of their biggest ahas for them is we can't, and I didn't say it, but when we take a hard left and we still think we're on a dinghy, but we're actually driving a ship, everybody's going overboard. You talk about, you lost them to the noise. You've lost them to all that, we can call it miscommunication, but I don't know if it's just miscommunication. It's just the realizing how many times we actually have to say it, and we have to communicate in multiple different avenues, email, verbal, text, whatever it is. How many times do you have to communicate something before all 20 people clicks?
And that's because of all the noise, like you said, that is going on.
And what kind of feedback loops do you need to establish? That's the other thing we talk about in the Navy, right? You have to communicate back to the ship captain, yep, we understood your message and we're clear on what needs to happen.
You say, you repeat the message and you say, I.
Yeah.
And so they've built that in, that closing that gap. Now they've went through years and years of training to make sure they have the same language and they know exactly what each word means, because it's a very complex world.
But those are great rules of engagement, right? And that's why things work so systematically. Do we have time to do this role play?
Yeah.
I would love to do this real
Yeah,
quick
go
for
for it.
people.
Yeah.
So again, even if you didn't have a chance to watch the webinar, or if you go back to watch the webinar, we showed a video about Natalie, the boss, and Tom. And so Ryan's going to kind of emulate Natalie a little bit, however he wants to do that. And I'm sort of going to be Tom, but I'm going to be a different Tom. And I think between the two of us, we can establish better communication. And I think this will be helpful to see what happens when situations like this come along. Feel free to also, as Natalie, come around if you want, but whatever you want to do is fine.
So what's the task? Do we just?
Oh, I don't know.
They're working on a report.
Yeah.
We just use the report as an example.
Go ahead and So you're meeting with me.
Hey, Lorraine. Glad you had a couple minutes to touch base on this.
Yeah, what's up, Brian? What's going on?
Yeah, so I was looking over kind of the future report that we're gonna deliver for the board, and I wanted to make sure that we really clean this up, that we really streamline the information for them. I mean, they don't want all this. They want something just much cleaner to look at.
Okay, so we went over this together. We talked about these points. So help me understand, when you say cleanup, tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, it's a little busy. There's a lot of numbers. There's a lot of information. They really just want the highlights.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you have a pretty good understanding about what they want. And you said there's a lot of numbers, and there are a lot of numbers in this report. I put a lot of work into this. What numbers do you think you would want them to see?
Yeah, I think some of the bottom line numbers, like what's our overall gross and for this project.
Okay, so you did not kind of give them that line items.
Yeah, we don't need the line items in there. We just need the overall.
Okay, I can do that.
Overall look of cost.
Okay.
And then what was the bottom line here?
Yeah. What else do you think would be good for me to clean up that you'd like to see?
I think there's a lot of text. We could just use one bullet point per.
Okay.
One sentence, maybe two per.
Okay. So
per
just
thought.
to make sure I'm aligning with you, maybe some of that descriptiveness in some of these points, kind of streamline it by just taking key elements and making that a bullet point. Am I following you?
If you can drill that down to what are two sentences, because right now what we got here is like a couple paragraphs.
Okay.
Per.
Okay.
So I think they're probably not going to have time to dig into this.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
I think that's everything. I think that looks good. I mean, if you could throw a little picture on there, that'd be nice. But other than that, yeah.
So just to make sure I just understand is use bullet points to capture some of the context in those more descriptive paragraphs. And then also to, instead of kind of having so many line items, you want me to just kind of give that bottom number.
Yep.
Here's kind of the gross on these different things, and then maybe throw a different image or picture on there.
Sounds great.
Okay.
That works.
So Nic, from your perspective,
That was thrilling.
What that was thrilling.
You like that?
Well, we are get you a different life.
I needed some popcorn.
What did you notice? What did you see? So obviously we could have showed a bad example, but for time's sake, I think it was more important to see how both of us came around.
I think the biggest thing I noticed is your use of open-ended questions to get clarity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then you asked the questions rather than just assume that you understand what he's talking about, and then you could leave and then generate something that was completely off point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny because talk about I didn't really know what I was trying to communicate. I mean, I was coming
Yeah.
up with it off the cuff, but when she asked me, it made me as the communicator stop and go, oh, what do I mean by clean it up?
Oh, that's
And now I got to come up with something here. I just know for me, I didn't like what I saw. And I think sometimes when we communicate like that, we don't, it makes us stop. And what I like about that is who was responsible for communication here?
both
Of us. And I think if there's anything you walk away out of here is whether I'm the giver or the receiver, we're both responsible.
Yeah.
for it.
I mean, if you watch that video and you see Tom, he's completely overwhelmed, and I could have gone into that and went, okay, well, cleaned up. What do you mean? And I probably would have left the conversation if I wouldn't have asked those questions, triggered and nervous, because like I don't know. I mean, does he want me to ditch this or does he want me to ditch that? And he just seems like he just I don't know what cleaned up. But by just kind of stopping, and if you notice, I asked him 3 times, and what else? And he kept narrowing it down and narrowing it down. Did you notice that?
Oh yeah, it was very helpful for me to be able to put together my thoughts. And here's one thing, supervisors out there, because this is what I would do is I would communicate in kind of broad terms like that and go, why aren't you getting it? Like we hired you for a reason. You're supposed to be smart. You're supposed to know what you're doing. You're supposed to be able to. But guess what? I have all these expectations. That and a lot of times hidden expectations is what we'll call them. But really it's bad communication. It's me not being able to articulate to them my expectations.
Yeah. When I was in, so prior to coming here, I've shared this before, I was in ministry and I was a creative arts pastor, and I had a big team of 80 plus volunteers. And something that I would communicate with them so that things would be clear is my role right now is to give you the frame to the canvas, you go fill it. And I would always share the example of, if I were to say, here's a paintbrush and some paint, go find a wall somewhere and just do whatever you want. Like, how overwhelming would that be for some people?
For something that's new, especially to their role.
What's the image? What's the goal? Where's the vision?
Yeah, what you want.
So I would always define the frame. Here's the canvas. Here's the size. Here's the frame. Have fun. Fill it, and then let them ask the questions like, okay, what about this? Like you did.
And I think I don't disagree. I think that can be really great for somebody to jump in and take the risk and dive in. I think one thing I'd always say is like, that works great when we can trust and we're comfortable with what they come up with. I think a lot of times what I would do a similar thing. I think that's what we prefer to do is to go, well, we hired you for a reason, just go do it. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that, but that's how I function. But then I would show up and go, this is nothing like what I wanted.
Yeah.
Who's that on?
Yeah.
Who's that on?
Yeah.
Well, that's on me, not them. And I think too often we prescribe, but if we truly are going to give them license, give them the license to do it.
Yeah, let me ask a question. Is it possible to over communicate?
It's a good question.
Well, I think if you are consistently repeating the same thing over, and driving home that point over and over, it's like, okay, I got it. I think that's
development level is going to be really important. So Lorraine has put together a report before. She's communicated effectively to the board before. They've liked what she's come up with. And then I'm coming in saying, no, clean it up. No, this, that. That's what we'd call a micromanager.
Yeah.
Right. That's, I would say, over communication around expectations or whatever. It's like, you'd probably be sitting there going, oh my gosh, goodness, gracious, right? I know what I'm doing. This guy's, blah, blah, blah. We fill in the blank. That, I don't know if we call that over communication, but it's being very constrictive in my expectations and where she's proven her ability over and over again. And why am I coming in trying to control? That would be from my place of trying to control and over communicate expectations.
What would be a better thing to say to me is, Lorraine, how are you feeling about the report? Anything that I can do to support you? Right? Again, he's asking me questions. I want to make sure that we say this, is that part where when Ryan was giving me that instruction, and obviously I was confused. And me asking questions is part of that feedback loop, right? Because if I just would have went, okay,
Got it.
that's, yeah. Ryan should not walk away. If he was watching some of my body language, and I even said, well, I put a lot of work into that, he might have even picked up on going, okay, listen, looks like you got some questions.
Yeah. I mean, one of the questions we received from the webinar, and we're running out of time, but one of the questions we received was, how would you respond to a situation where the person you're communicating with freezes and they don't say anything back? Obviously, they are triggered or traumatized or whatever, fill in the blank. But how would you as a leader recognize that and overcome that or help them through that?
I mean, I think what I would just do is acknowledge it by saying, it looks like this has kind of caught you off guard. It looks like you're struggling maybe to work through that. How about you think about that question? And let's talk about this tomorrow or later this afternoon. Would that be helpful for you? I think it's more important to just acknowledge it, not try to force the person. I mean, Ryan,
Give me an answer right now.
I sometimes people just freeze for whatever. Could be all the noise that's going on with them. I don't know. I just don't believe that you have to prod and poke somebody to get them to respond.
So using the DISC, this is where the DISC model becomes really helpful. This might be the reason, but S's on the DISC style, D-I-S-C, S's are that steadiness style. They tend to freeze under situations like that.
For just quick
changes, or putting a lot of they need, and C's potentially, D's and C's, they tend to be more cautious and reflective in their style. And so surprises will throw them off. And it will potentially cause them, or heightened emotion. So heightened, like emotion driven. So if I am being outspoken and fast paced with them, that's actually going to cause them to kind of bind up mentally. Is maybe a good way to put that. So
somebody in my class on Friday said almost those exact words. I freeze and I'm gonna, and she went like this, I'm gonna pull back. I mean, she even went into her body language, and I'm gonna shut down. It's So
there's the fight, flight, or freeze, and there's some other ones they've added to that list. But this is where the freeze comes in. It means that there's some level of stress. Some level of stress is being experienced. And so how do we, sometimes the challenge is on them to manage that stress.
That's right.
Better, right? There's that ownership there. So if you're that person, you have to find ways, because guess what? The world doesn't necessarily stop for us all the time. We have to find ways to lean in, rather even in the midst of our fear or concerns that we're experiencing. On the flip side, if I'm constantly that fast-paced person that's putting that person on edge, or not adapting my approach to where I'm giving them the information they need so they can think about it, if I'm constantly just coming out of left field, surprising this person with information or whatever. But when it comes to highly tense conflict situations, whatever, sometimes it's the pace at which we have conflict, I think is really what it comes down to.
Yeah.
It's the pace.
So just to recap, acknowledge, be transparent, ask them, give them space if they need that.
And encourage them to just, I want to hear what you have to say, that this might not be.
I feel like that would help establish more trust as well.
Yeah. For those of you that are fast-paced and outspoken out there, so the D's and the I's, they're not wrong. I think a lot of times was like, well, that's not the way you should engage, right? We have all these shoulds around it. I think you got to step back and go, there's different ways to respond to these situations, and it's not wrong. Sometimes it's not always helpful. Sometimes you do have to lean in and vocalize your point of view, even though it's uncomfortable. Yeah. But it's also going to be uncomfortable for you to slow down.
I think that brings us back to what we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, and just the aspect of being curious. Curiosity and in the communication, and intentional. Absolutely. So it sounds like almost we need to do a part 2 of this podcast.
It's the biggest topic out there, maybe.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about to communicate. So real quick, let's end this on, what would be a good book or resource or training or just something that, our participants could look into to help strengthen their communication style within the workplace?
Well, I don't know. I think there are so many great TED Talks out there around communication. And what I would do is spread your net wide. Whether it's reading an article or watching a TED Talk or listening to a podcast, pick up on nuggets that kind of make you go, oh. And we're not looking to reach a particular goal. What we're trying to do is just improve our communication. If I look at myself today, am I better than I was a year ago, 3 months ago, whatever? What's one nugget that I can do? So I'm all about other resources out there that you can use.
Yeah.
Well, let me give you a resource.
Okay.
This article popped up for me. The New Science of Building Great Teams by Alex Pentland. It's one that popped up recently. So something that I do is a lot of team development stuff. And it's like, do you want to know if you have a good team? And specifically, they measured and looked at the communication of a team. So I'll read you the 5 things that they found to be true around teams and communication and know if they're effective. Number 1 is everyone on the team talks and listens in roughly equal measure, keeping contributions short and sweet. 2, members face one another and their conversations and gestures are energetic. I think that it means on Zoom, that means cameras on. Members connect directly with one another, not just with the team leader. Members carry on back channel or side conversations within the team. That's actually a good thing, not a bad thing. And then members periodically break and go and explore outside the team and bring information back. And all of those, I think, revolve around that idea of communication on the team. And that was the number one thing they found is a team that has these things present on it means it's an effective team. So that's a great resource. There's a lot more in there where they map out communication, what a healthy team looks like around communication. So check out that article. I think it'd be helpful to
Can
you.
you say it one more time? And then
Let me go back to the...
Yeah, we'll include that in the link.
we can provide that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, great. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for joining us again for another podcast. We have several trainings through Frontline Training Solutions, like Purpose-Driven Leadership Training, Leadership Foundation, Supervisor Bootcamp, where they do kind of talk about communication in the workplace and how to effectively communicate as a leader, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd say if you're not a leader, check out Working Better Together. That'd be a good a good one to check out.
And this doesn't just pertain to leaders. It's just human beings.
Everybody else. Yeah.
We're always communicating.
Yep.
And just like George Bernard Shaw, what's the quote?
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion it has taken place.
There it is. So thanks again for joining us Behind the Frontline. Follow along, like us, subscribe, like this video, share it with your relatives, your neighbors. Everyone needs to communicate better, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time on the Frontline.